Hi, I'm Teresa Coenen with Stitchin, and today we're going to be going over Block 9 of our Parable series. Block 9 finishes as an 8-inch block. Some people tell me it looks like a spider, and others tell me it looks like a frog. It's a fairly simple block, and it follows the parable of the wise and foolish servant, which you can find in several places in the Bible, but the one that we use in our pattern comes from Matthew chapter 24, verses 45 through 51. I've done my block in 2 different colorways, plus an alternate colorway. Today I'll be demonstrating on the video using my alternate colorway, which is this one right here. If you would please, before we begin, let's open with prayer. Our prayer was provided to us by Trudy Double. Abba Father, we are your children whose love for you knows no bound, as the parables tell us. We are your servants, faithfully awaiting your return, watching for your return. Help us through this adventure of quilting your parables to reach those that do not know you. With each stitch, we will pray for the foolish servants that have not recognized you as their Lord and Savior, those that do not know you as their loving Father. Be with us today as we gather together and receive our new blocks and carry on spreading your word. In your holy name, Jesus the Christ, amen. Let's get started. Let's take a look at the pattern. Page 1 of the pattern has an image of the block, which finishes at an 8-inch block, the fabric requirements and cutting instructions. It also includes the parable in italics and a place with a reflection on that parable. Page 2 includes all of the instructions for completing the block. And on page 3, again, I have an image of the block. And when the block was first introduced to the Quilting Society, it was called Fool's Puzzle. I tell you why I chose Fool's Puzzle to represent this particular parable, and space for your own personal reflection. Let's take a look at our fabric selections. For me, I am doing the pattern in 3 different fabrics, 2 for quilts and 1 for special project. In my 2 quilts, I've got the blocks completed, showing the fabrics as they'll fit in with my quilts. For my Jesus the Teacher, in traditional fabrics, this blended mottled fabric appears in other blocks, and this turquoise is a feature of that particular quilt. I'm using the same background that I've used throughout the rest of the quilt. You'll note that I did not use any directional fabric because directional fabric is difficult to figure out in this particular pattern, particularly because you have half squares and quarter square triangles, and so you have to work very hard for placement. I certainly would avoid directional fabric in the background. Try not to use directional fabric there. Also, you're going to want to use a small scale print so that it blends nicely throughout the whole pattern. In my bright Parables quilt, these brighter colors appear in that second quilt. I'm using a colored background, which is different than the background that I've used from other blocks. Again, it's non-directional. But here you'll note that I used a directional fabric for these pieces here. In my original thoughts, I thought a stripe would look really cute in this particular quilt block. But when I chose a wavy stripe, it became very difficult to determine placement. So make your fabric choices very carefully, because it literally took me several different placements, lots of pictures to finally come up with this one. And I'm still not sure that it's my favorite directional print. I might change this block after all. For my extra project, I've chosen as a background this very mottled kind of a buttercream and white ash. And for all of these units here, shown green, this will be the fabric I will use for each of them. The special project will require 6 blocks, so I'll be cutting out for 6 of these units. And then for this small inset piece, I'm using 6 different colors of fabrics. So I'll be demonstrating today using this lime green. That'll be the demonstration I show in our video today. But as I make my quilt, I'll be using each of these different fabrics. Again, it's important to note that I'm not using any directional fabrics here. I'm not using any large scale prints. I'm using all fabrics that will show up quite easily. This is only an 8-inch block. So if I get too large with scale, it will be difficult to have it look nice in the whole block. This is an example of what I mean as far as caution for scale. This is a great K-facet fabric, and I love it. But if I were to use that in this block, when I make these quarter square cuts, one piece might be orange, one piece might be purple, one piece might be gold. And that's going to make this unit look very different. Now, if that's the look you're going for, go ahead and tackle that large scale print, but just know that it's not going to have the same cohesiveness. It's not going to look the same as the block shown on the design. Let's get started with cutting. Before I can cut the pieces, I have to make sure that my fabric is pressed and ready to go. I'll take this opportunity to press out any of the creases that have set into the fabric while it's been on the bolt or sitting in a tub. I'm just using a hot iron. I don't want to introduce steam or stretch into the particular fabrics. Before we begin cutting our units out, it's important to remove the selvages first. When you leave the selvage in the fabric in your quilt, it will shrink at a faster rate than the rest of the fabrics in the quilt because of the density of the selvage itself. So it's important to always remove those selvages and not be fooled into thinking that as long as they're inside the seam, they're not going to cause any damage of your quilt. Let's get started with cutting. The pattern calls for to cut several pieces in either 5 1/4 inch squares or 2 7/8 inch squares. When I'm cutting the 2 7/8 inch squares, I like to use a Marty Michelle instrument that has very clearly delineated 1/8 inch markings that are perforated so I can easily see my fabric below the perforation and make the cuts. The first units that I'm going to cut are the background pieces. The pattern calls for you to cut 6 2 7/8 inch squares. I've already pre-cut my strip to 2 7/8 inch, so I simply need to cut the 6 squares, making 3 cuts. And the pattern calls for you to cut these in half diagonally 1 time. You can stack all 6 pieces of fabric together making sure that the edges line up evenly. And make that cut by placing your ruler from corner to corner diagonally. We're going to be using these units as the background pieces to make these flying geese. I'll be showing you the method that you can use that just makes them traditionally, but I like to use half squares that have engineered corners. And so I use a Marty Michelle instrument that has an engineered corner that once I lay the instrument on the corner and I can trim those edges, they will fit evenly with the units that I'm trying to match them up to. And I'll show both ways in the video so that people who are making these flying geese traditionally can use these half squares, and the people who like to use engineered corners can use these half squares. The pattern calls for you to cut 1 5 1/4 inch square for the contrast, that's shown here in blue, and 2 5 1/4 inch squares for the wrap. So I have 2 layers of fabric here for my wrap. And this fabric is quite a bit longer than what a person would traditionally need. Normally you would only need just a little 5 1/2 inch strip of fabric to make these cuts. But since I'm making multiple blocks, I've got a larger piece of fabric. I've got this edge cut nicely and straight by removing that selvage. So I'm going to lay my 1 piece of the contrast right on top, and I'm using a squaring tool that has real clear 1/4 inch marks. So at 5 1/4, I'll make that cut. Now, in order to get a square unit, I'm going to need to square up this side. So I make sure I have a straight line here, and I'll straighten up that side, and then I can turn the entire unit around to cut that 5 1/4 inch square. And I'm really careful to make sure that it's absolutely square before I make my cut. I'm on the 5 1/4 inch line here. I can see I'm square across the top, and I'm lining up square across the bottom. So it's safe to go ahead and make that cut. This unit has to be cut in half diagonally twice. So we're making it into quarter square units. So I'll place my ruler from corner to corner. Make a cut. Make sure that the unit is staying in place. And then instead of trying to move the unit, I just rotate my mat. You can buy expensive rotating mats, but that was just as easy to rotate without an expensive mat. Place my ruler from corner to corner again. And make my cut. Now remember, I like to use those Marty Michelle instruments. So I'm going to go ahead and engineer my corners on half of the units, but not the other half, so I can demonstrate it both ways in the video. Now my contrast piece, which was on top, is cut, as are my wrap units that are underneath. This is a fairly simple block, but before I get started sewing, I do like to lay out my pieces to make sure that I have all the right pieces that will look the way I want them to look as I complete this walk. Now remember, some of my pieces have engineered corners and others do not. And there's my finished unit. It looks the way I want it to look. I'm not using directional fabric, but if I were, this is where I would make any adjustments. This was the point when I was putting this unit out that I had to really work at figuring out if I wanted the direction of the wavy rows to go out, in, if I make them match together or not. So this is where you would sit back, put your pieces in place, and if you are using directional or specific fabrics, take a picture of this unit before you go on to sewing so that you make sure you sew all your pieces in the right place. Step 1 of the pattern calls for you to make flying geese units that use background fabric and the wrap fabric that you cut previously. So I'm going to pull away these units and focus on these 2 units. This unit shows with the engineered corners, and this is with the non-engineered corners. I'll begin with the non-engineered corners. We'll turn your flying geese so that the point is facing up. With right sides together, you'll turn your background unit and you'll match it up, matching the corner and the right angle here. So that's parallel. This piece overlaps, and it's supposed to, roughly 3/8 of an inch, so that when you make your seam, it will go right through that overlapped, that dog ear, if you will, that piece. You'll stitch along this line, we'll trim off the dog ear, and we'll press it to the outside. If you're using engineered corners, you still hold the flying geese unit, the base of it with the point facing up. And now we'll add that half square unit, again, matching parallel, the right angle here, matching the point and the point, but you can see I have no dog ears. It is a little easier to put that through my machine. So I'm going to go ahead and put all of these units through my machine at 1/4 of an inch along that side. I'll be able to chain piece these units and take the chain apart before I move on to the second half of that step. I like to begin with the beginner so that I don't end up catching my corner pieces underneath that presser foot. Making sure that I have those edges even, I'll go ahead and sew at 1/4 inch along that side edge. And because I'm chain piecing, I'll just add the next unit right afterwards. Because I have chain piece units, I can just pop them apart with my chain ripper. It's a seam ripper that sets in a base that when I'm not using it, I can close it up. And when I need to use it, I just set it in the base and pop those seams apart. The pattern calls for us to press these units to the outside. So with a nice hot iron and no steam, I'll set the seam by placing the iron on top, fold it open with my finger, and then press, holding for 5 seconds. Now that we have the unit this far, the pattern calls for us to add the other half of the flying geese. Again, I'll do the very same thing, matching this bottom point, keeping parallel here. I've got my nice perpendicular 90-degree angle. And you'll see again, I'm overlapping roughly 3/8 of an inch. I'll be doing a 1/4 inch stitch down the side, just as I did before. This is a regular cut unit with no engineered corners. This unit does show you the difference when you're using an engineered corner. Again, I'll line up this bottom corner. And you'll see that that lines up evenly. That's why I like to use the engineered corners. It makes it a little easier for moving that through my machine. I'll go ahead and chain piece these 6 units. The pattern again calls for you to press these units to the outside. With the engineered corner, set the seam, fold it open, and press to the outside. With the non-engineered corner, the traditionally cut corners, I set the unit, press to the outside, and then I'll need to trim my dog ears. I can use a rotary cutter and a ruler, or I can trim them with a small scissor. Now the 2 units look fairly identical. The pattern calls for the unit to measure 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and it's essential that you measure before you move on. So that unit I can see measures up correctly, as does this unit. If I needed to make any corrections, now would be the time I would need to make them. Sometimes I might need to trim a little bit. Sometimes I might need to take a seam apart. In these 2 cases, my units measure correctly. And I can see that I'll have a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance right there at my point. Step 2 of the pattern calls for you to create the 4X unit that goes in the center. You'll take 2 of your triangular pieces. This is my wrap and this is my contrast. Contrast goes on the right, wrap on the left, and you're going to match them up with the 90-degree angles. I'll fold that over like a sandwich and stitch along this line at a 1/4 inch. I need 2 units that are identical. The pattern calls for you to press these seams open. So you simply open the seam. So you simply open the unit, use your finger to finger press the seam first before setting your hot iron in place for 5 seconds. Again, you can see the difference between using engineered versus non-engineered corners. On the non-engineered corners, I do need to trim my dog ears. In step 3, the pattern calls for you to take your 2 units from step 2, place them together. You'll fold it over like a sandwich, match that center seam, and stitch. Now I like to pin that seam, so if I'm going to pin it, I'll either pin it in the uphill side of the seam, so that as the unit runs through my machine, when the needle is set in that seam allowance, I can remove my pin, and that will make it so that the seam doesn't wiggle or move on me. I also like to, personally, when I'm using a nicely pressed seam like this, I like to use a fork pin, which is a double-headed pin that has a bend here that you can get a hold of, and you can place a pin on either side of that seam, setting that seam firmly in place. Now with the fork pin, it's a very thin pin. You can very slowly travel through that pin if you like with the machine, but I'm an old schooler. I like to pull that pin also once my needle is settled into that seam allowance on the uphill side of the seam. So I've stopped my machine. My needle is set in the uphill side of the seam, and I'm removing my pin. It's important to make sure you remain a true 1/4 inch all the way to the end. And whether that means you're holding the end in place with your finger or using some sort of a tool or an instrument, or even the pointed edge of your scissors. It's important that you don't let that end scoot away and trail to the right or the left. The pattern calls for you to press this seam open as well. Before you begin pressing, it's always good to check and make sure that your seams match nicely in the middle, because if you need to make an adjustment, now's the time to make that adjustment. Again, I like to open it with my finger and finger press that, particularly at the seam first, before I use the iron. And then again, I set the iron in place for 5 seconds. You'll trim any dog ears. And measure this unit before you move on. The unfinished unit should measure 4.5 inches square. And that's exactly what I have here. So I'm ready to move on to step 4. Step 4 of the unit requires that you stitch a flying geese unit to the top and the bottom of your 4X unit from step 3. You're going to make sure that the wrap is matched up with the contrast before you begin stitching. You'll flip the unit over like a sandwich, match those seams, and I like to put a pin in the unit so I make sure those seams don't wiggle on me. I know it's not a very big piece, but I'll have more success if I actually pin this unit. And I'll run that through my machine at 1/4 inch. The pattern calls for these seams to be pressed open. So before I press again, I like to check to make sure that my seams match up nicely, because if I'm going to make an adjustment, now's the time. And once again, I'll finger press that unit before I set the iron in place for 5 seconds. The pattern calls that the unfinished unit should measure 4.5 inches by 8.5 inches. And that's exactly what I have here. So I'm ready to move on. Step 5 calls for you to stitch 2 of the flying geese units together side by side. So they lay them out side by side, turn it over like a sandwich, and stitch. Now you're going to have a lot of bulk right here coming into that outside seam. I'm matching up those seams, but so far everything's been pressed in the same direction. So it's really important to pin those seams in place, because they're going to want to push as you remove them through your machine. So I'll pin those seams in place in the uphill side of the seam, making sure that once I get my needle settled into that seam allowance, I'll remove the pin. The pattern calls for these seams to be pressed open. But before I press them, I like to take a look and make sure that my seams match nicely, because if there's going to be an adjustment, now is the time. I'll turn the unit over and I'll finger press that seam first, because there's quite a bit of bulk here where these 2 flying geese meet. So I'll finger press that first and then set the iron on for a good 5 seconds. Pattern reminds us that the unfinished unit should measure 2.5 inches by 8.5 inches. So I like to measure it before I move on. And that's what I have, is 2.5 by 8.5. In step 6, we're going to add the units from step 5 to the sides of the unit from step 4. There are no seams to match, but it's important that we make sure that we stitch through the center of these 4X units here to make sure that they're stitched perfectly. So I'll actually, once I pin them in place, I'm going to pop a needle into those units and I'll show you how. Turn it over like a sandwich, and I'll begin by pinning my outside edges. They have no seams to match, so as long as I pin those edges flush, they'll be in good shape. Then I'm going to pin the center, and I'm going to take a pin and drop it directly through the apex of where those two flying geese units meet. Straighten the unit out to make sure I have my fabric straight, hold it in place, remove the pin, and then set the pin in the uphill side of the seam. If I were to pin it through the apex and then move the pin to try to pin the unit, I'd actually move the back down by about 1/16 of an inch. That's why I'll pin through the apex, make sure I have the unit straight, hold the unit, and pin through the uphill side of the seam. Now I have apexes on the back side of my unit as well. So I will do the very same thing. I will pin it through the apex, make sure that the unit is straight, hold it in place, and pin the uphill side of the seam. Apex, straight, hold, and pin. It's ready to move through my machine. The pattern calls for you to press these seams open, and before I do, I like to open it up and make sure that I've cut all my points nicely. I can see that I cut off a point right here, so I want to make an adjustment. Once I've opened that seam out, once I've eased that seam out a little bit, I'm ready to go ahead and press these seams open. You can see it's a little more difficult now to press these seams open because of the amount of bulk of the seams coming in and out. So it's kind of wobbly. You'll have to first finger press each seam, paying particular attention to the bulkiest parts of the seam, and finger press those open first before setting your iron in place. While the iron sits in place, I'm using my thumbnail to finger press the rest of the unit. And there my unit is complete. This is an 8-inch finished block, so it should measure 8.5 inches unfinished. And before I put it away, I make sure that it does measure 8.5 inches unfinished. And because I'm going to be using this block again, as I move it in and out of my finished quilt, I'm going to edge stitch about a scant 1/8 or 1/16 of an edge around the block unit itself, so that as I handle it, I don't end up inadvertently stretching or getting it out of shape. And there you can see that I've edge stitched around that edge. That way the block itself will remain nice and square as I handle it multiple times throughout the rest of the quilt. And that's block 9, Wise and Foolish Servant. If you have any questions along the way, give us a call, send us an email, or post a message on our Facebook page, and we'd be happy to get back to you. Thank you and have a blessed day.